Created in 1982, Gridrunner has a pedigree that marks it among the first wave of classic video games, but the chances are you've never heard of it. Created by Jeff Minter's Llamasoft, Gridrunner is a prime example of both the creative kleptomania of the early video game scene and Minter's own iterative design aesthetic as the game grew beyond a hodgepodge of stolen mechanics to become a cult classic in its own right. As one of the few solo game developers with such a long and accessible history of games under his belt, Gridrunner is also an example of a game that has undergone constant evolution as Jeff revisits the game often to add new layers of mechanic and audiovisual excess to the bones of a game that began life over 40 years ago. Minter is quite open about how the origins of Gridrunner came from seeing screenshots of Atari's Centipede arcade cabinet designed by Donna Bailey and Ed Logg, in which a snaky centipede descends the screen surrounded by mushrooms that would make it change directions, all the while dealing with interference from a pesky spider. When the player shoots the centipede, it splits in half where it's hit, with each half taking different directions, all the while bouncing off the various shrooms littering the screen. Here I'm showing the Atari 5200 version that remains fun and playable to this day. Minter describes in his autobiography on the Llamasoft site how he'd never even seen Centipede running when he first came to design his own take on the formula, and you can play his first tentative version via Digital Eclipse's excellent Llamasoft collection that includes, as young Jeff puts it with hyperbole only an ambitious teenager can muster, the first ZX version of the new arcade game. The intro screen describes the game as the greatest new idea since Space Invaders, which gives you an idea as to the game's geriatric provenance. In Little Jeff's version, mushrooms are replaced with black squares and the centipede is just a string of zeros. Your ship, limited to moving left and right like in Space Invaders instead of the free movement of the original coin-op, shoots quotation marks. There is no audio yet. The game is primitive. It plays like the video game equivalent of a band's first rehearsal recording. It's scratchy, poorly mixed, blown out, but showing the bones of something greater beneath the distortion. Mere months later, as Atari began to side-eye the rampant copyright infringement that was the early bedroom coding community, Minter wisely decided that the future was in his own IP, where even if the ideas weren't totally original, it would at least make it harder to sue him if he came up with his own names for his projects going forwards. Kind of. Inspired by the then new movie Blade Runner and the neon fever dream of Tron, Minter combined the two to come up with Gridrunner, a centipede-like for the unexpanded Commodore VIC-20. The title inspired the game's iconic red grid. The futuristic vibe continues as the centipedes become droids and the mushrooms become pods which hold bombs. Over time, the pods burst and drop bombs down towards the player. A big change to the centipede formula was the addition of a deadly and infuriating laser affectionately known as the bloody laser thing. One moves along the bottom of the screen and will periodically fire upwards. If you're in its way, you die. And you will find yourself in its way with alarming frequency. Paired with this is another moving gun on the side axis that shoots a bullet when the laser fires, creating a pod where the two intersect. In the early VIC-20 version of Gridrunner, this projectile will also kill you, but in later versions it will pass through harmlessly, which is a change that I'm thankful for. If you pay close attention, you might notice that the laser tends to fire in the same places fairly often, or to drift a position each turn. Careful awareness of where the laser has been and where it might be going next is key to survival in most versions of the game. While you are dealing with the traditional arcade shooter enemies, you will also need to keep track of what's happening in your environment. This applies to the bomb pods, which mutate with each pass of the bloody laser thing, beginning as a seed, blossoming into a flower, and then dropping into a very fast bomb that will obliterate your ship in this early version. The bombs are created by both the laser and by shooting enemies. Pods will cause the enemies to change directions as well, so you need to balance your attention between clearing bombs for your safety, shooting the enemies and watching out for the bloody laser thing. It is a bit challenging. These days you can play Gridrunner in either the excellent Llamasoft collection from Digital Eclipse, and also as a bonus feature in Gridrunner Revolution, which we'll get to later on. Interestingly, despite both being labelled as the original VIC-20 version, there are some key differences between the two instances of this same game. The Digital Eclipse version runs significantly faster than the Revolution pack-in, or at least it feels like it. The DE version has crispy pixel graphics, whereas the Revolution version has a slightly ugly bilinear filter applied to it. The games have different intro screens, although both say 1982. One refers to your lives as men, the other as runners. The Revolution version offers more accuracy as your ship feels like it clicks into the grid position more easily than in the DE edition. And most puzzlingly, the Revolution version offers more freedom of movement, allowing the player to move around in 2/3 of the screen, whereas the DE version restricts the player to the bottom third only. The differences between these versions are a mystery to me, and I will say that as a player I prefer the more sedate pace and greater control of the Revolution edition. I do prefer that pixel perfect look of the version from the collection. Regardless of the version, the game is crushingly hard for a modern player. Games will often last less than 5 minutes, sometimes by quite some margin. The side gun being able to kill the player will result in many deaths where you just have no idea what killed you. The bloody laser thing is somewhat more predictable, encouraging the player to stick to a side of the screen they like the best, noticing the drift of the laser over time. Enemies are fast and aiming is challenging. If you're not careful, bombs will build up and drop all at once, although one friendly feature is that bumping into the bombs won't kill you, unlike in later versions. The original instruction guide for the game suggests that good players will score in the region of 100,000 points, and I've only managed to achieve this once in the Revolution edition of the game so far, with the Digital Eclipse version proving much more challenging. Gridrunner was subsequently ported to the Atari 2600 with a chunkier, less polished quality compared to the VIC-20, where Jeff will frequently remind us that it's the unexpanded version. And the Commodore 64, which has the opposite effect with its increased resolution leading to smaller sprites and a feeling of being zoomed out compared to the VIC-20 original. While Minter himself has expressed a preference to the original that I agree with, the C64 version is the recipient of a visual overhaul in the Llamasoft collection, making a port of the original into the most recent version some 40 years later. This Gridrunner remastered was programmed by Digital Eclipse's Mike Micah instead of Jeff Minter, making it the first official Gridrunner release not directly made by the great man himself. This pedigree shows somewhat in that it includes some touches that might be called Minter-esque without being something I think he would actually include in the Gridrunner game himself. The main culprit of this is the way in which the field of view gradually tilts as you move around the playfield. While it adds a touch of visual dynamism, the effect for me after prolonged play is a sense of seasickness, which is not something I usually experience with Llamasoft games, no matter how aggressive the visual mania on screen will become. For me, Minter will often try to confuse or obfuscate the playfield with excessive effects, sometimes even tilting the field like this, but not constantly. He'll return to a point of equilibrium eventually. The disorientation is meaningful and applied specifically, whereas here it's used constantly, a simple connection between player position and grid orientation. You move, it moves. After half an hour of play, I find myself becoming queasy from the movement and almost want to flip back to the original just to rid myself of the sea legs. Skipping back to the original is as simple as holding the right bumper on your controller, as the remaster employs the same trick as other games like Halo Anniversary or the Monkey Island remake, where the remaster sits as a layer on top of the original code, adding a sheen of glowing neon to the underlying ancient brickwork of the C64 original. Leaving the old code relatively untouched means that the game still has the digital rigidity of the original, where this might have been played on a keyboard. Playing on D-pad for this might make more sense than a stick, since the movements you need to make are small and precise where a stick might overshoot. A quick stab at a button might be more appropriate. One very fair and fun change this remaster employs is to give the bloody laser thing a slight glow before it discharges, giving you a vital second to get out of the way, and slightly negating one very lethal and fairly annoying element of the original game. If you can get past the lurching in your stomach from the drifting playfield, this remaster does prove one of the best ways to play classic Gridrunner, retaining the speed and brutalist digital nature of the original while adding small quality of life tweaks and dopamine-inducing score floaties, llama shapes, and a slightly more modern vibe. This is the version I've achieved some of my best scores in so far, and if I'm playing Gridrunner, it's either this or the Revolution version that I'm playing. At the time, Gridrunner was very well received by the nascent gaming media and the buying public alike. As Jeff has commented in the past, a year previously he had failed out of university, and next he secured an American distribution deal, allowing him to make Llamasoft into a career in a growing industry that hadn't even existed when he was at school. 1 year later, Minter released an iterative sequel called Matrix Gridrunner 2. Released in the US as Attack of the Mutant Camels, not to be confused with the actual Mutant Camel games Jeff would later come to release, we should first mention the eerie similarity between the glitchy green font of this game and a certain series of movies released some 15 years later. In addition to stealing the plot of Grant Morrison's Invisibles, did the Wachowskis also lift the font and title from this obscure British arcade shooter? Because when I loaded this game up for the first time, I literally said, "What?" while looking at the top of the screen. The game itself is, as mentioned previously, an iterative sequel, appearing on both the VIC-20 and C64, with the visuals again receiving a resolution bump on the more powerful Commodore. The core gameplay is mainly identical, but the levels have more structure. There are new enemies, new enemy behaviours, and crucially, the bloody laser thing gets an upgrade whereby a little bloody man, or a snitch he's sometimes called, at the top of the screen will slowly follow you around the playfield. If you stop for too long in one place and the bloody laser thing passes, the little bloody man will call down the lightning and blast you to pieces. Frick. This mechanic likely comes from the fact that one of the best strategies in the original Gridrunner is just stay put, blasting away where you know it will be safe from the pattern of the laser, using the bombs to increase your rate of fire and catching ships in the gulf between. The little bloody man also means that you can no longer stay in one place. Wild movement will kill you, so careful dodges are the order of the day. In addition to being a pure annoyance, with time you can use the location of the little man to know exactly where and when the laser will fire, allowing you to move out of the way with practice and your awareness of every element on the screen. In Matrix, the grid now scrolls slowly as you play, lending a queasy feel to proceedings, although not as pronounced as in the remaster. Sometimes the grid is gone entirely, leaving you with the inky blackness of the void to play against. When enemies reach the bottom of the screen, they now hoon around the playfield diagonally at breakneck speeds, often causing a death out of nowhere. Interstitial levels featuring those pesky mutant camels are added as they float down from the top of the screen, granting the game a measure of pacing before adding them in later as extra enemies in normal levels, as an extra complication. Some levels see the addition of diagonal paddles taken from Deflex, one of Llamasoft's earliest games. When these paddles are hit, they will change orientation and with it the direction of the player's shots. This begins as a diamond in the centre of the screen on one level, and later levels add dozens of paddles, making your shots bounce around the screen. This is more of an obstacle than a mechanic used for shooting, since you're more likely to hit yourself with the deflected shots than any enemy, but it adds a Space Invaders-like touch where you need to position your fire between obstacles on the field, with the added danger of reflected fire. While Matrix doesn't receive the love and kudos of the fondly remembered original, the changes and improvements serve to make the game slightly easier to get into and then much more challenging and varied as you dig deeper into the levels. The game is still incredibly tough, and even with modern rewind abilities, it can still be a struggle to make it through the levels once you start moving up the ladder. Matrix is a single step of evolution in Gridrunner and Minter's own design ethos, broadening out from the single mechanic focus of the early arcade scene and edging towards the more varied level-based approach he takes in many games later in his career, as well as introducing livestock iconography into the series. We then have a 5-year gap between Matrix and the next Gridrunner game, Voidrunner, released on Commodore systems in 1987. Voidrunner is a fairly radical reinvention of the formula coming from Matrix. Gone is the grid, replaced now by floating patterns of pixels, taking inspiration from the trippy visualizers like Colour Space that Minter had become famous for, a nod towards his later preoccupation with neon particles. Gone too are the explicitly centipede-esque trains of enemies, now lines of geometric shapes leaving behind arcane ellipsoid bombs in clusters on their destruction. The bloody laser thing becomes more inscrutable as well, changing orientation from left to right to top to bottom. Now, instead of a lightning bolt from the blue, the laser has a constant presence on the field, scrolling down the screen. At intervals, this laser will flash blue and split, with a deadly after-image left for a second as the main beam carries the journey downwards. There's little sound and no flash of light to accompany this, so the player must be mindful of where it is and where it fired last in order to avoid this deadly obstacle. Your ship itself is probably the most extreme change from the early versions of Gridrunner to this 1987 update. Instead of a single unit, you play as an array of 4 triangular craft arranged in formation. For the first level, this is easy enough as you shoot up towards the enemies, but as the stages progress, you will encounter progressively more weird and hard to play configurations. The second level flips the orientation 180 degrees and has you shooting down towards the bottom of the screen. Later levels will find you arranged as a diamond, or shooting in 4 cardinal directions, or with ships arranged diagonally, so your shots do likewise. On one level, your ship controls are reversed. On others, you control 2 groups of ships in symmetry, splitting apart and reforming. This inventive variation proves to be the backbone of the game, as enemy configurations remain relatively simple, as the player craft represents the greatest challenge from level to level. One exception to this are the new bombs in this version of the game. Blue bombs appear as an obstacle to be avoided and destroyed. Bumping into them will cause you to lose a life, unlike in Gridrunner and Matrix, where you could just bash into them without injury. Red bombs, however, will shoot out a very fast red line at your ship if you pass under or next to them. Being within half a screen of them appears to mean certain death if you're in their sights, so you'll need to bait them to fire and turn blue before they can be destroyed. Visually, the game is more colourful and somewhat prettier than the originals, although the stark red and black theme of Gridrunner remains iconic and powerful in its simplicity and readability. Voidrunner sees Jeff embracing and contributing to the late 80s video game aesthetic with aplomb, with unskippable full-screen graphics unfolding slowly between screens. While the display of colours and melty animation might have been flashy in '87, it shows its age in 2024, and slows the player down as you wait seconds for credits and stage names to fizz away in rainbow pixels. Around this time, Minter's visuals become wilder, more neon and overtly bovine in nature. Levels have names like Goat and Llama and Beast, with one particularly tough level being nothing but a row of glowing dogs' heads, as Minter adds more of his own brand of charmingly wonky British schoolboy humour to his games. The game itself is something of a mixed bag, and could be considered the weakest in the series. The twinkling, oscillating soundscape lacks the punch and simplicity of early games. The enemies are small and weedy and often move too fast to even see properly between screen refreshes. The ship evolutions are fun and creative, but can be confusing and overwhelming as well. Voidrunner lacks the crude innovation of Gridrunner and the polish of later editions, although it shows a trend towards the psychedelic and swirling neon that would come to define the rest of his career. Moving ahead 2 years and a console generation, we encounter Super Gridrunner for the Atari ST. This marks an important moment both in Gridrunner design and the shape of this essay, since there are problems with the Digital Eclipse presentation of the game that means we need to make something of an archaic technical detour, all in the name of chasing the perfect experience. I often tell anyone who will listen to me that my favourite metagame is making games run on hardware they're not designed for, particularly when it comes to the Steam Deck, which I kind of consider to be something of a Rosetta Stone of gaming. I've been a fan of emulation since the 90s, and the thrill of playing a game lost to time on new hardware never wears off for me, and the Steam Deck is kind of the ultimate expression of this, a beautiful and feature-rich handheld with God's own screen, and the flexibility to play games from many different eras. When the promise is you can play everything, then I often edge towards the very frontiers of what is possible or sensible using this device, a topic that maybe I'll come back to in the future. With Super Gridrunner in particular, the version in the Llamasoft story collection is labelled as the Atari ST version, but is actually a later Jaguar port that is considered by experts, or one really motivated crank on a forum, I'm not sure, to be vastly inferior to the ST original. In the most basic terms, ST Super Gridrunner controls with a mouse. The Llamasoft collection does not even have mouse support that I can see. This makes the game play completely differently. Your ship is much slower, your ability to dodge is reduced, the specific ship mechanics are hindered by the button layouts. The game description specifically mentions how this was the first Gridrunner with mouse controls, and as I knew from later games in the series, a great way to play these on the Steam Deck is to use the device's trackpads. So I discovered the unfortunate Jaguar roots of this port from a forum poster being an utter dickhead to a very calm and reasonable Digital Eclipse representative. While I take the forum poster's point that the collection is advertised as having ST games, and instead has inferior Jaguar ports, and I hope DE can rectify the labelling, instead of piling on to insult the developers further, I set about looking into the weird world of Atari ST emulation. The game is fairly easy to emulate on a PC using emulators like Steam, with 2 E's, or Hatari, which I personally use due to it having a Linux version for the deck. You can download ST images directly from Llamasoft's website. The Super Gridrunner disc, hilariously, is a multi-game pirated copy by the Pompey hacker scene, which gives this relic of the past even more of a nostalgic air of glamour. the auto-booting text file when you load the disc, was written some 35 years ago by whatever cartoon caricature of a 1980s teenager just popped into your head, full of naive, anarchic by way of young one's energy. Getting into Super Gridrunner itself, the ST original is night and day different to the Jaguar port in terms of snappiness, although a mouse alone will not protect you against this infuriatingly challenging game. Super Gridrunner introduces many new tweaks on the formula, some that will stay with the series and some that will only have a fleeting visit. Mouse control will stay a fixture of the series going forwards, but the dual-part nature of your ship with its body that you control directly and its nose cone that you can call back to yourself and shoot through to augment your shots is new for this game and this game alone. The nose cone defines this game, and it is a novel mechanic. Using Shift and Alt keys, you can change the spread of fire with 5 different options that you will need to employ at different times. Sometimes the cone will mean a difference between life and death. With times you'll need to keep it close and use the Alt fire, and times it's best to leave it in a corner for suppression fire while you're free to move around the field. The game itself is brutally hard in new and sometimes unfair ways. It makes a point of teaching you earlier that snakes can come from all directions of the screen at once, and in level 5 and 6 there are particularly unfun encounters where enemies will suddenly come from all directions at once, at a speed that is very hard to react to without real practice and quite a lot of luck. The speed of the game is itself a real challenge, with some events happening faster than I'm able to react to more often than not, and this feels like a fault of the game, much like in Voidrunner, where sometimes enemies are faster than the screen can update, and it will kill you between frames of movement. The bloody laser thing has been replaced by what looks to me like the paragraph indent marker in Microsoft Word, only this fires a blue ball of death at you whenever you wait underneath it for more than a fraction of a second. On later levels there are several of these which can be quite frustrating. The game also has a mechanical regression. In Voidrunner, if you died mid-level you would come back to life where you died and the level would continue. This is a mechanic that Minter would come back to use much more often in his later games, as opposed to in OG Gridrunner and Matrix, where a death would mean restarting the level and needing to somewhat memorise the patterns. In the earlier games, this was less of a problem because their nature means the enemies stand out less. There are fewer programmed gotcha moments in the levels, just twitch reflex shooting that gets harder. Super Gridrunner, evolving from the level gimmicks introduced in Voidrunner, takes this further, with each level having a specific theming with enemy patterns that stand out to be remembered, and several gotcha moments designed to kill the player and require memorisation. Level 2, for instance, ends with a single rocket fired out of the bottom of the screen at your ship, and when you die, you need to repeat the entire level again, and makes the game less fun than it otherwise could be. This game is absolutely not without its charms, and I find myself actively wanting to like it more than I do. The graphics are colourful and readable, the sound is aggressive and weird, especially on the ST original. The ship control is fluid and interesting. Super Gridrunner also contains the first use of power-ups in the series, beefing up your weapons, granting extra lives and invulnerability, marking perhaps the first appearance of bullying in the series, or maybe even Llamasoft's oeuvre, more of which on later. But the difficulty of the game, needing to 1cc each level before you can move on, the sheer speed of it, makes it hard to progress without frustration more than later games in the series. Back to the idea of speed in the Steam Deck though. Getting Hatari to work on Linux was simple enough, and the game is very playable with trackpad controls. RetroArch also has a Hatari core, but I didn't find it much use myself, and the options are obscured. It was hard to get running properly. The trackpad is still somewhat stiff compared to a mouse, but it's still fun and much more preferable than the stick controls in the Digital Eclipse collection. One aspect in which the deck is useful, in this case, is to be able to choose the refresh rate of the screen. Playing the game at a standard 60Hz results in a very fast experience, but throttling the screen down to 50 gives us something of a more sedate and playable experience. I found it a little too slow on testing, and it has the effect of stretching the sound to make it more granular, so I increased the speed to 53Hz for a happy medium that plays smoothly and sounds acceptable. I know this is cheating, but it does make the experience more enjoyable while keeping the still incredibly high level of difficulty the game was built around. While I didn't click with Super Gridrunner to the extent that I wanted, it's also important to view these games in context. A player in 1989 would have spent days and weeks playing this game compared to the few hours that I spent with it, most of which is on levels 5 and 6, which are some of the harder levels in a video game I've played in my life. I can imagine with a lot of time on my hands and not much else to do, I could get better at this, but the reality is there are more enjoyable and less frustrating Gridrunner games still to come on this list. It would be some 13 years before Gridrunner would return, in the far-flung future age of 2002. In the meantime, Llamasoft would produce genre classics like the Robotron cheese nightmare of Minotaur 2112 and the legendary Tempest 2000 on the ill-fated Jaguar. Ever the digital pioneer, Minter was now experimenting working with the new Pocket PC platform, a proto-smartphone device with a colour screen and stylus controls. Jeff's dev tools meant that he worked on Gridrunner++ on the PC, developing the PC and Pocket PC versions in tandem. Eventually he came to realise that this new incarnation of Gridrunner was perhaps a little too hot for the Pocket PC, and instead finished the game for release on PC proper. The legacy of the original platform means the game is played in a phone-like portrait orientation, and on the Llamasoft site a dead link points to an ancient mobile phone version of the game now lost to time and technical progress. The PC version still plays wonderfully, and even works on the Steam Deck, which is my preferred way to play it. Much like Super Gridrunner, the game is played with a mouse or trackpad, but now without the need for any other buttons at all, as Jeff abandons the fire button like a vestigial tail, no longer needed to serve the perfect expression of the idea of a shooting game. While Gridrunner++ sees a leap forward in graphical complexity and a true emergence into Gridrunner of Jeff's digital narcotics approach to visual design, the gameplay is stripped back to the very basics of the genre and is all the more effective because of it. Movement is no longer one-to-one with the mouse, but instead your avatar floats lazily behind your arc of movement to add a dreamlike quality as multicoloured trails of your ship reminiscent of Voidrunner follow in your wake. Enemy designs vary wildly from crunchy space insects in a callback to Centipede to geometric shapes to sprites lifted from old games and a further display of Minter's magpie aesthetic. Bright and shiny things, borrowed things, exploding things, all mixed up together. The eponymous grid is now abstracted to the point of delirium. You're now inside the grid as markings stretch forward into infinity, drowned in woozy particle effects, neon gibberish and exploding imagery. The bloody laser thing makes a return as an XY axis lightning strike linked to a mystery cube floating in space before you that occasionally lurches towards the playfield, signifying it's about to fire. It's lethal but also well telegraphed, making it remarkably fair for a Jeff Minter game. Bombs also now explode in 4 directions, leaving a trail of fire like a mini laser. Sheep figure heavily into proceedings, each one you collect adding to your score multiplier and triggering a Stephen Hawking's-esque voice to pine for the fluffy beasties. Powering up with your sheep will add a bracket-like blast to your weapon similar to the nose cone fire in Super Gridrunner, and also allowing you to shoot forwards and backwards at once, like one of the ship arrangements from Voidrunner. New to this entry is a floating sheephead that I can only describe as vaguely flirty, which will, if you bump into it enough, turn into a roving, bleating sheephead of automatic death, obliterating enemies on the field. All of this comes together in a kaleidoscopic mix of crispy particle effects, fizzing explosions, numbers cascading into infinity looking like a Technicolor dot matrix printer churning out blacklight mandalas, which is to say it looks quite nice. Gridrunner++ is a remarkably more friendly and approachable experience than Super. Brutal, crushing frustration is a thing of the past, and ++ moves the series into one of extended play. ++ takes the punishing skill barrier of previous games, itself a holdover from the arcade influences that spawned the VIC-20 original, and calms them down while amping up the sensory overload of flashing lights and gibberish sound that is the platonic ideal of the arcade experience. The game then forms the basis for Llamasoft's difficulty curve moving forward, from being games where your life expectancy could be measured in seconds, to now stretching to minutes and hours if you have the skills even. The difficulty of the stages is slowly stretched out to a more even curve. The game barely tries to murder you until level 10. That's Jeff showing some restraint right there. He's getting a bit less sadistic as he slides into middle age, obviously. Minter also builds on and enshrines his industry-leading Restart Best mechanic, adding it in as a menu option now, although it did debut earlier in the series. The beauty of Restart Best is if you have a run where you get to level 10 and game over, next time you play you can start off at level 10 with a full complement of lives and carry on from there. In terms of level-based shooters like this, it's an absolute revelation. No more are you forced to struggle replaying the same early levels again and again. Now you can replay favourites, or more appropriately, replay levels you struggle with until you can breeze right through them, or at least die a little less. ++ reverts back to the Voidrunner idea of letting the player continue on from where they died as well, rather than restarting the tricky level. Restart best and continue on death combine to almost entirely remove frustration from the Gridrunner series for me. Now they become something that can be practiced and honed, rinsed. ++ is something of a missing link in the Gridrunner family tree. It's obscure to the point where it's not even available for sale anymore, instead offered for free on Llamasoft's charmingly Web 1.0 website. In a largely forgotten and overlooked series, this is the most neglected of all, and yet as much as any game in the series can be considered to be the template going forwards. In the years that followed, Jeff met his partner in design and love, Ivan Zorzin, known to the community as Giles the Sheep. Giles' contributions to Llamasoft allowed the games to blossom visually with his support on the tech side of the project, allowing Jeff to focus on bringing his gameplay to life in increasingly complex virtual machines that would come to define the engines behind Llamasoft games into the future. Llamasoft worked on a cancelled GameCube game called Unity with Peter Molyneux, planting the seeds of the idea that would bear fruit thanks to a more productive forthcoming relationship with Microsoft, who were readying their next generation Xbox 360 hardware. Division head and mid-2000s style icon Jay Allard was a fan of Minter's, proving that he had great taste in both hoodies and game developers as he hired Llamasoft to produce the music visualizer for the 360, known as Neon, and based on concepts he had come up with for the Unity project. In the decades previous, Jeff had experimented with the concept of light simps with releases such as 1985's Color Space, up to his work on the Jaguar with the Virtual Light Machine or VLM, pioneering the visualizers used in programs like Winamp and Windows Media Player. Neon itself was baked into the 360 OS, making Llamasoft an integral part of one of the most successful consoles of all time, perhaps some kind of karmic retribution for Jeff's bad luck for picking the next big thing in tech, having previously hitched his wagon to duds like the Konix Multisystem, the Atari Jaguar, and his aforementioned dabble with Molyneux, not to mention with endeavours into the future. Building on his work with Neon, Minter released Space Giraffe on Xbox Live Arcade, which was where I first encountered his work in my 20s. This was an era when downloadable games were still new and very rare, so a new XBL game was a fairly big deal and deserved at least a look at the demo to see what it was all about. The release split the 360 player base at the time between bewildered punters who couldn't understand what they were even looking at, and freaks having their minds blown by this tsunami of visual noise and the obtuse but somehow intuitive arcade gameplay. I of course fell into this latter camp, and marked Llamasoft games as something to pay attention to when they would next cross my path. Space Giraffe itself was an evolution of the themes found in Jeff's Tempest games, but while the goal of Tempest is to shoot and avoid enemies, Space Giraffe does the opposite and encourages bunching enemies up together and then bullying them off the screen by smashing into them, a mechanic that would later become core to the Gridrunner series after entries like Super Gridrunner flirted with the idea with its invincibility power-up and bovine iconography. I've played it a touch in the research for this essay. I say a touch, it's now been about 8 hours. And it is as overwhelming and mesmerising as it ever was, and worthy of a fuller investigation when time permits. The game is still available on Xbox. You can play the 360 backwards compatibility version on the current series consoles, although on my Series S it's still stuck in 720p hell on the TV, far too big for that to look good still. The Steam version is good with some weird bugs that can make it hard to play, but it is actually very playable on both PC and Steam Deck, and it looks fantastic and plays really, really well. The somewhat blander Nux mix is playable, but the furry eyeball freakout acid edition is just incredible to look at and is insane to play as well. Anyway, Space Giraffe is great fun, and I do recommend it if you can make it work nicely, so moving along. In the years that followed, Minter had continued experimenting with the next Gridrunner. Originally called +++, but changed due to the unwieldy nature of that name, Gridrunner Revolution would arrive in 2009, and similarly to Space Giraffe, the technology and visual style was heavily based on the Neon Light Synth. Jeff excitedly stated at the time that this technological jump signalled an end to his era of janky programmer art, with the light synth capable of producing intense, overwhelming psychedelia that reacted to what the player was doing. After years of working on his own unique visual style, the Neon engine allowed his aesthetic to blossom into an explosion of melty, swirly, acid-tinged insanity, moving his games into a realm where simply nobody else was working on his level. Gridrunner Revolution is something of a sidestep in the linear progression of Gridrunner games to this point, in that it is not really trying to replicate the style or gameplay of any previous entry. The visual overload of ++ is present and amped up significantly, taking the pixel pointillism of the previous engine and blowing the doors off. The gameplay takes the basic idea: there are snakes of enemies, your ship shoots bullets, bombs litter the field, but it twists them into brand new shapes. Sheep return as collectible power-ups, beefing up your shots and acting as a last-minute life preserver. Now, if you're hit, you have a moment where you can control your exploding carcass around the screen. If you pick up a sheep at this point, you trigger a sheepy save and come back to life without losing any ships, making for an incredibly fair and generous mechanic. Your ship can now rotate, allowing you to fire in 360 degrees, which takes a little getting used to. You have a selection of ships to choose from, each with its own attack spread and style. Unique to this entry is the concept of stars and black holes. Each level will begin with a star in the centre, and on harder difficulties this will pulse and release waves of bullets at you in complex mandala-esque patterns. Focusing fire on this will blow it up, creating a black hole that affects your shots with gravity. The game then becomes about finding the perfect spot to sit and let the gravity of the black hole bend and warp your shots all around the screen, efficiently killing anything it comes into contact with. With Revolution, Minter recontextualises Gridrunner from a punishing, twitchy arcade shooter into something almost calming and meditative. Revolution is about finding the zone and sitting in it, letting the waves of colour and sound wash over you harmlessly. In many ways, it's the opposite to the aggressive, diamond-dense assault of Space Giraffe. Revolution wants you to chill out, relax and enjoy the pretty colours and nostalgic techno music. Not that the game is a pushover, and it certainly will try to kill you at points in levels that serve almost to ensure you're paying attention, before dropping you into another series of levels that let you enjoy the pretty colours again. The accessibility is reinforced with the level select. Not just a linear progression of levels, Revolution features distinct difficulty modes all named after a dish of curry, Minter's favourite food. No self-respecting Englishman would be happy sticking with just a korma, so we go straight on to file when we sweat through the pain, of course. That's just how we do curry in this country. Each flavour comes with a set of levels tuned for that degree of spice. Restart Best makes a welcome return now, so if you crash out halfway through a Vindaloo run, you can jump back in and curry on without having to redo the early warm-up levels. The more approachable level of difficulty does introduce a new wrinkle to the series that hadn't been an issue before, which is that of the player's time. A good player can now probably play a full run of all levels in a set in one sitting, but that can stretch out to an hour or more of time. While this is great and can allow you to really get into that zone that Minter wants to allow you access to, but it's less appropriate for a pick up and put down casual play. On my Steam Deck I have lost entire commutes to Revolution, nearly missing my stop home once because I couldn't possibly be there already, could I? The game makes time evaporate into a swirl of neon and sheep noises. In all, it's a very nice time, and something of a palate cleanser in this rundown of fairly punishing shooters. As we move along to the next phase in the story of Gridrunner, I realise that I need to set the context a touch as we move into the realm of the early iPhone video game scene. Phones seem modern, but we have to remember that we've had them for 15 years now. Yes, you are old. While it might seem impossible to think of now, the advent of the iPhone briefly signalled a golden era in experimental game design, with what is now in retrospect a concentrated burst of creativity and frontier spirit not seen since the bedroom coding days of Jeff Minter's teen years, when games like Gridrunner were first conceived. With the advent of smartphones with good touchscreens, gaming has suddenly received a new input method that millions of people had in their pockets. The iPhone arrived at around the same time as the Xbox 360, and both platforms allowed indie games to edge into the mainstream in ways that hadn't been possible since the early 90s. Small teams like Llamasoft, who had previously been operating in the margins of the industry, were now allowed access to more mainstream platforms, and the early App Store was fairly easy to publish on, so there was a rush of weird, experimental, artistic content coming out for a good few years. Games like Cannabolt, an early endless runner perfect for a device you just needed to tap once to jump with no fine control. Esoteric point-and-click masterpiece Sword and Sorcery EP with its incredible pixel art before that was a thing again. Early Rocket Cat and Sumogo games like Hook Worlds and Year War, and of course the Llamasoft games that we'll come to talk about next. There are people watching this right now who can't conceive of a world without touchscreen devices, and yet there was a time now quite long ago where they were novel and exciting to both gamers and developers. Of course, this underground spirit has soured by 2024 into the mobile gaming landscape we have today, with all conquering giants basically owning the space, and the concept of what can this thing actually do, largely answered with an apathetic shrug of the shoulders by the gaming audience at large as well. As a venue for capital G gamers, phones never really stuck and proved too lucrative at fleecing suckers for publishers to mind either way. All of which brings us to the heartbreaking Llamasoft of it all. I'm glad that Jeff made a good amount of money early in his career, because boy would he need it in the lean years to follow, which are arguably creatively his most fertile since the early 80s. For around a year starting in 2011, Llamasoft released 9 games for iOS under the Minotaur project umbrella. For the sake of brevity, we won't go through all of these. Suffice to say that Minotaur Rescue is a fantastic asteroids rift that is tragically lost to the ethers of time, never to be played again. All of the Llamasoft iOS games are lost on pre-modern devices, and due to low sales and the cost of continued development to keep them running, they were removed from the store entirely. The sad reality is that in this period, the world forgot Jeff Minter, and the Minotaur projects saw game sales in the low thousands on an app store increasingly cluttered with predatory, addictive games valued over unique, genre-pushing experiences that Llamasoft were providing. And despite releasing banger after banger, especially in the past 2 decades, Llamasoft is still unremembered outside of crusty retro enthusiasts and explorers like myself, looking for that pure, distilled video game magic we believe must exist somewhere out there in the digital void. This isn't Jeff's fault. His games have only gotten better over the years. The gaming landscape has changed, and the mainstream public just don't care about these kind of experiences anymore. They don't even float to the surface for people to discover. I consume a lot of gaming media, and nobody talks about this stuff. I was one of the happy few that found and loved the Minotaur Project games as they were coming out, and I rarely heard about his career in the time between then and pretty much now, as I've been rediscovering his output over the course of the last year. The recent Llamasoft collection in 2024 did see a long overdue round of polite applause and recognition from the nerdier corners of the gaming community, but the fact is it barely registered a blip in the larger gaming world, just like other recent releases like Aka R, Tempest 4000 and Minotaur Arcade, more of which on later. The sizes of the scoreboards for these on Steam clock in the low thousands. Simply nobody is playing these incredible games, and it absolutely breaks my heart. All, however, is not entirely lost. While the iOS originals are gone, Jeff did release a smattering of Android ports on his website that you can go and get right now, including for our sakes the sublime touchscreen edition of Gridrunner. The march of technology means these mostly won't work even on modern devices. My old phone ran it at 4 speed, my current phone won't even boot it, but thankfully a slow old Android tablet happened to be able to run Gridrunner mostly without issue, other than an occasional frame drop and a slightly stretched aspect ratio that I will need to learn to live with, so I am in luck. The footage here is taken from my Android version. Unfortunately, the recording doesn't allow sound due to the age of the OS, so I'm using the sound from the similar enough 2018 version as to the sound bed here. With this version, Minter returns the series back to basics for the first time in nearly 30 years. The stark red and black grid returns, as does the now charmingly retro classic ship design. Enemies are back to being spiky little balls similar to the VIC-20 original. The bloody laser thing makes a return, now with a brief warm-up animation that allows you a second to get out of the way in order to not be completely unfair like the old days. Bombs also return in their classic form, although now for the first time you're able to shoot and pop them, instead of the instant death that they would bring in earlier versions, accompanied by a pleasing touch phone trill of beeps. Indeed, this touch version of Gridrunner and the subsequent Steam version we'll talk about soon introduce a new approach to sound in the Gridrunner series that is a joy to behold. While the classic games were limited and made excellent use of the ancient sound chips in those old machines, The new editions of Gridrunner feature a consciously retro soundscape that is joyously cacophonic with punchy zaps and bleeps and boops and twinkling explosions and wildly oscillating frequencies all swirling together. It sounds like an entire arcade being played at once and is a wonderful addition to the oral side of the series. Control using the touchscreen is smooth and intuitive. Llamasoft Games perfected touch controls right from the off, as Minotaur immediately knew that the idea of a fixed on-screen joystick was just bad design. Instead, the Llamasoft games use simple gesture-based controls. Just move your finger or thumb in the direction you want to go and that's it. There's an element of acceleration to the input, so you don't need to move quite one-to-one with the ship, and controls soon become second nature. It's not quite as smooth as with a mouse or a stick, but it is very playable indeed, allowing for fine control and large sweeping movements easily. The game itself sits in a sweet spot of difficulty. New players might find themselves overwhelmed by the speed and aggression, but with practice the controls become second nature and the game settles into a flow-inducing pace. Unlike the soporific, hypnotic flow of Revolution, this new Gridrunner induces its flow state through intense, focused combat and audiovisual flair. Making a return from the days of Super Gridrunner, power-ups make an overdue comeback to the series as brightly coloured rings that you now need to collect as they fall from destroyed enemies with a variety of effects available. We have slow motion, which also stops the bloody laser thing for a minute. We have invincibility that swells you up and allows you to bull enemies off the screen as the Space Giraffe mechanic shows its influence on the series. Some power-ups will modify your shots, allowing you to fire backwards or in 4 directions, or diagonal shots like the nose cone from Super, or in some cases erupting from your ship in all directions at once in a swirling maelstrom of death and celebration. At the start of each life you're also invincible for a few seconds, encouraging the player to race around the screen, obliterating anything in your path, a mechanic that will come back expanded in the next edition of the series. The game also features a host of new enemy types to disrupt the classic Gridrunner action, including weird snaky dots that drip down the player field, or stolen Millennium Falcon sprites that dive down from the top of the screen. Slow-moving enemies reminiscent of the gummy ship from Kingdom Hearts fall slowly then explode into bullets halfway down the screen, but if you shoot them early they guarantee a power-up. Spinning galaxies bounce unpredictably around the screen and take many shots to destroy. All of this combines with ever-escalating difficulty, more bullets, more chaos as you progress through the stages. At the end of each level you receive 1 extra life, so with careful play and use of the restart best mechanic you can amass a collection of dozens of lives which might allow you to progress further into the more chaotic later stages. As a final bonus to the package, turning your device sideways will also allow you to play a touchscreen port of the VIC-20 original. This plays more like the port from Revolution than the version found in the Llamasoft collection, particularly in regards to the amount of screen the player is able to move in. In this latest port, the player is able to travel to almost the top of the screen, making 3 versions of ostensibly the same game. This version appears to be something of a rework as the sprites now act more like scalable vectors with smooth rotation as opposed to the jerky digital movement of the original. It does remain fast, hard, and very playable, however. Jeff has spoken publicly about the lackluster sales response to the Minotaur Project games despite glowing reviews from every outlet that played it, with Jeff referring to the period as the worst 2 years of his career and expressing disappointment that these great games were languishing in limbo on old devices. The period after the Minotaur Project saw another leap in creativity and style from the Llamasoft team though, and during the next few years they would release some of the best games they had ever made, embracing new VR tech as well as allowing them to be played in traditional flat-screen versions. This period would see the legally iffy TXK released on the PS Vita, another example of Jeff's poor luck with embracing yet another soon-to-be obsolete device, and receiving a legal rebuke from Atari for ripping off his own Tempest 2000 in the process. This was followed up by Polybius, a lightning-fast rail shooter that is widely hailed as one of the greatest VR games ever made. And after making up with Atari and releasing the wonderful update of Tempest 4000, Jeff and Giles turned their attention back to the lost Minotaur Project games again with Minotaur Arcade Volume 1 in 2018, aiming to polish them up and release them again for a second chance of life. This collection included a refresh of his silly platform and Goat Up, but also a remix of the iOS version of Gridrunner, bringing us to the final and perhaps most perfect edition of the game to date. In a way, it's obvious that this gambit did not really work, and the obscure title of the collection likely worked against it as the game quickly disappeared from public consciousness. But I'm here to tell you that this is perhaps the greatest arcade-style shooter ever made, and can be considered as the peak evolution of a game that has existed almost as long as the medium itself. Gridrunner 2018 should be included in the same bracket as games like Pac-Man CE, Tetris Effect and Space Invaders Extreme as being the ultimate expression of a clean, pure strain of video games that every gamer worth their salt should be familiar with. Built upon the newest expression of Llamasoft's virtual light machine technology, the framework allows Jeff to design games quickly with his trademark visual excess baked in as part of the very soul of the engine behind it. In Gridrunner 2018, this manifests constantly as exploding, expanding halos of pixels and particles accompanying almost every action. Enemies explode into swirls of colour and voxel noise. At the end of each stage, your ship outline expands into space as a hypnotic arrangement of dots. Even the playfield, no longer a static background, is mutilated into new and sometimes bewildering shapes. Sometimes it's flat, sometimes a slight curve. Sometimes it's a sphere, or the perspective shifts wildly as you move around the field, like a much more aggressive and experimental version of the seasick-inducing wobble from the DE remaster of the original. Returning to the idea introduced in Atari ST Super Gridrunner, enemies now come in all shapes and sizes. Commodore keyboards, Union Jacks, cakes, strawberries, pills, abstract shapes. Minter gives a nod to the nostalgic British kookiness that has been a staple of his games in a celebration of that early bedroom coder spirit. The gummy ship, wibbly snakes and spinning cubes of the iOS version return to mix up the gameplay, along with several new additions to the enemy roster, like the new spaceship that appears in many stages. This deadly and annoying foe will track you and shoot you from all directions of the screen, often leaving the playfield only to return and catch you out. Early variants of these are simple enough to handle, but later levels will see them return quicker and more aggressive and in greater numbers. Asteroids and red suns are hurled seemingly just to use up the stock of lives. Another evolution from the touchscreen version is that of the X-bombs, which on the iOS version would spit out bullets when shot, with the bullet spreads increasing in density the deeper into the game you get. These make a return in 2018 as what I call towers, little bumpy rainbow coloured things that sometimes appear in lieu of bombs in later levels. Shooting these will result in a satisfying boing sound effect, along with a hail of indestructible projectiles that you need to position yourself carefully to avoid. Shooting this also has the effect of speeding up your bullets significantly into a brief water hose of death, with so many levels becoming about the effective management of these risk-reward encounters, since not noticing them exploding will inevitably result in your death. All of these new enemy types combine in different formations to make each level feel truly distinct and memorable, which is a welcome shift in the emphasis for the series. Each level can feature subtle rule changes and gimmicks that must be engaged with and understood to ensure success, and adds a layer of intellectual engagement to a series that has traditionally purely been about twitch reflexes and skill. For controls, Gridrunner 2018 is playable with sticks or a mouse/trackpad. Stick control is generally excellent, and even has the option to use both sticks at once for a speed boost, which isn't something I've ever seen used by other games in the genre. Mouse control is really where it's at though, offering a precise and fast input method, and this also extends to the trackpads on Valve's Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is by far my preferred way to play this game, and the trackpad control is something approaching perfect, allowing smooth and incredibly precise control of the action and feeling very nice as well with the haptic feedback on the trackpads. Personally, I found that my own performance was massively improved with this method, to the point where I currently sit somewhere in the top 10 of the Steam scoreboard. The game is also available on PS4, and I hear that the trackpad on the PlayStation controllers also works as an input device, although I have no idea how well that works in practice. Restart Best makes a welcome return in its perfected form, this time allowing you to choose any level to restart on instead of every 5, encouraging the player to really drill down on the tougher levels. And this game does not hold back at all. The quality of life improvements mean that Minter is able to ramp up the complexity and difficulty to sometimes unbelievable levels. You'll need a good stash of lives if you're able to get through the level with all of the purple flying things that come at you. I think it's like 34 or something, with more than a handful of lives left. I've played that level so many times. I eventually got through it losing 3 lives, but some goes I would lose 20 lives. It's incredibly hard. And there are levels like the one with all of the cows, and they're seemingly impossible without death and abusing the ball mechanic to clear the screen as quickly as possible. If you just shoot the balls, they just swell up and become faster and drop bombs on you. As you move into the upper tier of levels around the 20s and 30s, you start to encounter marathon levels around 10 minutes long, which can be a real test of your endurance as you must keep focus in these increasingly hectic and dangerous arenas. In order to mitigate some of this challenge, Gridrunner 2018 features a new approach to power-ups not seen in the series to date. The game keeps the general influence from the Touch Edition, with power-ups granting changes to shot spread able to be combined and amplified together. But crucially, picking up any power-up now also grants a brief window of invulnerability. The timing of this varies from level to level, but if you're flashing, you're invincible, and you're able to bull enemies off the grid. This buff doesn't disappear immediately either, so even once you stop flashing, you appear to have a second or two left, and so the game frequently becomes one of pushing your luck, smashing into enemies hoping they'll drop a power-up in order to keep the chain going. While in previous games the best strategy was likely to place your ship in the lower quarter of the screen, Gridrunner 2018 encourages super aggressive play, with your first action on starting a level nearly always being to fling yourself up to the top of the screen and smash wildly into any enemies that you can find in order to trigger a power-up chain. There was one level in the 40s that appeared impossible at first due to its speed and complexity, until I realised that the best strategy is just to bull continuously. It's a long level as well, so I spent a mesmerising 5 minutes smashing from one side of the screen to the other as the sound and visuals exploded in wave after wave of twinkling particles and just noise. It was, to put it mildly, incredibly fun. Gridrunner 2018 is a celebration of the form of the classic arcade shooter, but with every single aspect interrogated and refined. Everything in this game feels purposeful and placed with precision for an exacting effect on the player. Previous games in the series have certainly had levels that stick out as unique, all the way back to Matrix on the VIC-20, but with this entry, Llamasoft have truly crafted something close to the pinnacle of the genre, incorporating ideas from every entry in the series, keeping what works and discarding what doesn't. Gridrunner 2018 is the platonic ideal of video games. It's a simple pick up and play experience with a single input method and an easy to understand goal, and yet with seemingly infinite complexity and the ability to shift subtly underneath and around the player, offering new facets and dimensions to the basic formula at every turn. When describing the game, Jeff has referred to it often as just a remake of the iOS version, which I think is truly underselling the achievement it represents as the pinnacle of a form that Jeff himself helped to define originally. All of which does beg the question of how the audience at large has missed this absolute gem of a game. My feeling is that it comes down to a number of factors. Firstly, I think that Llamasoft themselves are just not that great at marketing, which is a real shame because what they're doing really does speak to me personally, so it's sad that it doesn't seem to appeal to the wider public at large. I could say that about so many things that I love and nobody else cares about at all. These games feel handmade in the very best way. There's a real sense that the barrier between Jeff and Giles to you the player is paper thin. They've just made this and you're playing it. There's no whiff of corporate agenda or crass commercialism here. They embody the have-a-go spirit of the 20th century. It's probably not a coincidence that bedroom coding and punk rock came about at roughly the same time in history. And just like the spirit of punk that was tamed and commercialised, the video game space has become increasingly corporatised and conservative and hyper-designed to the point where the bric-a-brac vibes of Llamasoft are unfashionable and easily subsumed in a realm of billion-dollar games, sucking the life from the video game community. This is compounded by the impression in the last decade of a slow death of these score chase games in the wider consciousness. For children now, video games is Nintendo or Fortnite or Minecraft or Call of Duty. There's little space in the landscape for these abstract, somewhat disposable and ephemeral experiences that used to form the bedrock of what video games were, and Llamasoft struggles to make their case to an apathetic public. The landscape has changed significantly since, say, the Xbox 360 era, and the birth of the modern indie games movement, where almost any game release was something of an event. An early must-play on the 360 was Geometry Wars, for example, but by the end of the generation, stores were drowned in indie games, and that has continued to this day. Perhaps if Llamasoft were present for the indie rush of the early Nintendo Switch era, they could have made an impact. Or perhaps now if they embrace the Steam Deck as the best place to play their games, they can make a dent. Although the community for the latter seems more interested in playing massive unwieldy games like Cyberpunk or Elden Ring, compared to the more bite-sized experience that are more perfect for handheld gaming. Following the largely positive, if muted reception to the Llamasoft collection, my hope is that it inspires more people to check out the latter half of Minter's output, because I believe it represents the height of his powers as a developer, and anyone who tries these games and engages with them on their own terms is in for a wonderful time. In a world where so many games are so similar in tone and feel, Llamasoft games feel like something truly alien and yet totally familiar. They're retro-futuristic artefacts. They're yesterday's possible tomorrow that never quite arrived, except for in these rare, overlooked packages. I've loved immersing myself in these games as I researched and put together this essay. In this journey I've explored the punchy, brutalist beginnings of Minter's career, learned about the venerable Atari ST and the vagaries of its ancient operating system. I've played games on keyboards, using a mouse, using a stick, using trackpads, all in search of the perfect way to engage with them. It is trackpads, by the way. I've returned to the perfection that is Gridrunner 2018 for more hours than I cared to think about. I became accidentally sidetracked by Space Giraffe, which was no more than 2 paragraphs in this, for about 12 hours. Accidentally, I also became one of the best players on the planet at a game that more people should be playing, if there were any justice in the universe. I've dug into many other Llamasoft games as well, particularly the terrifyingly fast Polybius and the indescribably entertaining Aka R, Llamasoft's latest release from 2022. I don't know if Jeff plans to revisit Gridrunner again in the future. Now in his 60s, perhaps he's looking to retire with Giles and his sheepies and leave the cruel world of games development behind. But I hope that he returns to the series maybe one last time, so we can bask in its glow once more. After all, it's only 8 more years until the VIC-20 original turns 50, and who knows what the future has in store.